The Supreme Court ruled in June that concealed carry permits, that's the right to carry a gun outside the home, was protected by the Second Amendment. And that has changed gun control laws around the country. Well, now the county in Maryland, where 3 of the Supreme Court justices live, just passed a new law that completely violates what the Supreme Court said in the Bruen case. This new law just passed the county council and says that people cannot carry a gun 100 yards of anything that is public assembly, which is basically everywhere. And also 3 of the Supreme Court justices live in Montgomery County. It's Justice Gorshuch, the Chief Justice John Roberts, and Justice Kavanaugh. All live in Montgomery County. So it's in their own county. They cannot carry outside the home if they're within 100 yards of pretty much every place where people gather. Well, I have a special guest with me who is an expert on all the Maryland gun control laws. And stay tuned towards the end of the interview because we also talk about the other challenges they're facing in court, including the so-called assault weapons ban that everyone in America is watching Maryland challenge. I have with me Mark Pennak, who is the president of Maryland Shall Issue, which is a Second Amendment group in Maryland. It's very powerful. He's also an attorney who practices in D.C. and Maryland. Mark, thanks for being with me today.
My pleasure. It's always a pleasure to see you.
This bill that passed the Montgomery City Council, you live in Montgomery County, as well as 3 Supreme Court justices. And those Supreme Court justices are the ones who voted in favor of the Bruen decision that said you can't infringe on the Second Amendment right to carry outside the home.
Correct.
Now the City Council or the County Council votes today in order to change that law. So tell me about the law, tell me what passed today and more detail about it.
So what the law was intended to do, and this is Bill 21-22, is eliminate the current exception for carry permit holders, which under Maryland law, a person can apply to the Maryland State Police for a right to carry a pistol, a loaded firearm outside the home. Mm-hmm. And the existing county law, it had an exception to its very strict anti-gun ordinances that allowed for carry permit holders to carry within the county. And what this bill does is basically eliminate that exception. It also redefines prohibited places where even carry permit holders no longer are allowed to carry any firearm, not merely a pistol, anywhere in the county. And it's a long, exhaustive list, and it makes it effectively impossible to carry in the urban parts of Montgomery County, which is to say most of it.
Most of the county. I mean, the bill is called not public assembly is how they call it, that there's no prohibited to carry public assembly.
They call it within the 100 yards of a place of public assembly, and then they define public assembly by putting out a long list of places which they deem to be places of public assembly. And that includes churches, healthcare facilities, schools, polling places, government property, healthcare facilities, assisted living facilities, fairgrounds or conference centers, and the like. It's quite extensive.
So basically, it means you can't carry anywhere because you're going to be within 100 yards of one of those places in the county.
Yeah, basically that's correct. And there's 5 places that were identified by the Supreme Court in the Bruen decision, and those were government buildings, polling places, courthouses, legislative assemblies, and schools. Mm-hmm. And the Supreme Court never
suggested. Just to clarify, that's what the Bruen ruling in June, Supreme Court ruling said that those are the 5 places, yes, that states can prohibit gun carry. We're not going to allow, then New York said, oh yeah, you can't carry in Times Square. And the court said, no, these are the 5 places. So those 5 places, the court has already preemptively said those you can ban if you need to ban. Not everyone does. But the county has now, the county where these justices live have taken it to this absolutely extreme, opposing the action.
It has, because there's nothing in Bruen that allows them to include a buffer zone around those places, like the 100 yards, which they have for all these places. And there's certainly nothing in Bruen that allows them to designate all these locations beyond those 5 that the county has now deemed to be gun-free zones completely.
Yes,
So
exactly.
they have gone way, way overboard.
And this is, and they're not making it a secret that they're doing this. They're actually, that they're violating the Supreme Court ruling where the Supreme Court justices live. They actually say in their press release today, this is in response to Supreme Court ruling that said, which was a New York ruling, but is applied to all of the country. Second Amendment guarantees your right to carry outside the home. And they said because that is given, Maryland, the state, has changed their gun carry laws and allowing anybody who wants to have a carry permit go through the process to get a carry permit. This county is saying, well, Maryland's letting too many people have gun carry permits and it's a danger. So they're going to do it preemptively, then the state's going to do it. And the state's not going to do it.
Well, I hope not. The state's not going to do it. What remains to be seen what the state legislature will do when it convenes in January. But New York has already tried this tactic of banning a possession of firearms with carry permits all throughout the state, and its statute has already been struck down for multiple locations, including many of the very same ones that the county identifies here. The county doesn't seem to care that this is not going to survive judicial review. It just went ahead anyhow. And it makes no attempt to do what the Supreme Court said it must do, which is find an historical analog to these sort of bans, historical analog going back to the time the Second Amendment was created in 1791. So,
and just to clarify, there was no law in 1791 that you can't carry within 100 yards of, an assisted living home.
Well, certainly not, or for that matter, within 100 yards of any place. There was indeed some places actually required that people bring their firearms to church, for example, or to other places. So there's certainly no our parks as well. So there's no precedent at all going back to 1791. And I've looked that could possibly justify this sort of broad-based ban. And indeed, because Montgomery County has so many places on this list, it's very hard to transport. And the ban includes transport without actually going within 100 yards of one of these places. So
interesting. Okay, so includes transport, meaning that people with carry permits can't even go through 100 yards of, say, an assisted living home.
That's correct. Or through within 100 yards of a county park. And this is not just a county park. It means any park publicly owned or privately owned. So it doesn't matter that it's privately owned.
So basically, once this passes, what are you going to say to your members in Maryland Child Issue, and how are you going to advise them to legally carry in Montgomery County?
Well, it's going to be extremely difficult to legally carry in Montgomery County. We already have a lawsuit pending in federal district court challenging an earlier law passed in 2021, and which this bill amends and changes. So we will simply be amending our complaint in that existing lawsuit to challenge 2122 as passed today. So that's assuming that the county executive will actually sign it and it becomes law. But it becomes law immediately upon signature. There's no waiting period. So people are going to have to get used to the idea that you basically cannot exercise your carry rights as recognized by the Supreme Court and as preserved by Maryland state law for the carry permit in Montgomery County. And that's quite intentional.
Yes, they've said it. They said in their press release, we are intentionally doing this in violation of, they don't say violating, but violating Supreme Court ruling. And like I said, the three Supreme Court justices who live in Montgomery County, the Chief Justice John Roberts, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and Justice Gorshuch all live there. And they voted for this. They were in the majority in the Bruen case in June. They were in the majority who voted in favor of saying that gun carry is your constitutional right. They struck down the New York law that said you had to prove a need for it, which is what changed Maryland law as well. So it's their hometown that's doing this.
Yeah, that's exactly true, and nor do they care. You're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, and they don't. It seems like they're just throwing it back in their faces.
I think that's a fair interpretation.
And we don't know, obviously, if any of the Supreme Court justices, they have a lot of security, but it is important to know that Brett Kavanaugh had an assassination attempt against him recently. There are
Yes.
still protesters outside all three justices of these justices' houses regularly. This has been going on since, I think, April, weekly. I mean, they are in danger themselves.
They are.
And this law applies to them. I mean, it applies to
Yes,
everybody.
it applies to them, and it applies to, frankly, everybody who's not a commercial security guard or a police officer. There are very few exceptions to this.
Yes.
So it's it's we are concerned as well with the number of people who are illegally carrying firearms in Maryland, and particularly in Montgomery County is it is the most urban county in the state.
Yes.
And we're left defenseless by this legislation.
Yeah, they said that this is in response to extreme gun violence, was what they said this is in response to. But they also said, which they said there were 11 homicides in the county last year. I wouldn't define that as extreme gun violence. And then they said it's in response to the Supreme Court ruling, which Maryland has abided by, the state has abided by. But this one county, yes, which is, I would say, for those people who aren't watching from this area, the most liberal county, obviously, definitely in Maryland, but in the D.C. area. I mean, this is liberals D.C., but people live in Virginia. But that's why 3 of the Supreme Court justices live there. It's a suburb of Washington, D.C., but yes, extremely liberal, and they've always been like way ahead on a lot of laws. And so this is really, for them to do this one specifically right after the Supreme Court ruling is really just throwing it in the faces of the justices who live there.
Well, they disagree with the Supreme Court's ruling. Now, they're perfectly entitled to disagree all they want. What they're not entitled to do is write their disagreement into law, yes, and thereby criminalize people who otherwise have a constitutional right.
That's right. And so where this goes from here, the county executive most likely will sign it. There's no indication that he won't. And then it's going to be enacted. And you said you're going to amend a current lawsuit to include these changes.
Yes, that's our plan. And I've told the county that in so many words, and they know that that's coming.
They do. And what was their response to you when you said you're going to waste taxpayer dollars fighting something that is never going to be held up in a courtroom?
Well, I think the county attorneys in candor probably know that, but they work for the county and they will salute and go off and defend it to the best that they can. That's what their job is. So they understand what's coming down the pike. And I understand the county council, who most of whom are not lawyers, don't care.
Yeah. Yeah.
So and they get to signal their virtue, I guess.
They signal their virtue. Also, tell me, what is the latest on concealed carry permit holders in Maryland? How many are you all hearing there are? Because it's blown up since June. I just keep hearing bigger numbers.
So as of a month ago, there were 70,000 permit holders in Maryland. My recollection is. And permits are coming into the Maryland State Police at roughly the rate of 500 a day. So wow, it's still tiny in comparison with the 870,000 permits or so in Virginia, or the 1.4 million permits in the state of Pennsylvania. So I don't think we'll ever reach that. But nationwide, it's roughly 10% of the eligible population who have these permits. So it will be a while before Maryland gets to that. That's about hundreds of thousands in Maryland.
Hundreds of thousands.
It would not surprise me if we got there eventually.
How are they making the process?
The state police are actually doing a very good job of complying with Bruen and processing these permits in good faith. So my hat's off to them. They have not resisted Bruen at all. And they were instructed by the governor and by the attorney general of the opposite party to comply with Bruen. So they are not enforcing Maryland's good and substantial reason requirement. Now they're enforcing all the other requirements imposed by Maryland, which are as more onerous than virtually any other state in the union, including its training requirements and background investigation requirements and the like. I mean, I think of all the shell issue states in the country, of which there are 43, only one other state requires 16 hours of training, including a live fire scored course of fire.
And DC has 17 hours. of training
Yes, DC
required.
has, and New York's just amended its statute to require 18, so they set the record now.
I mean,
So
it's a full-time job. They
it
really
is,
make it. It's an incredible full-time job.
and it's
Um,
very expensive
it's
as
very
well
expensive.
because
Yep.
you
It's
have to pay
prohibitively
the
expensive.
instructors to do this
Yep.
and that's hundreds of dollars.
Yes, it
So
is.
it's
I've done
expensive.
that. Yeah, so have you. And it is extremely expensive, which explains probably why the numbers are somewhat lower in Maryland than in, say, Virginia, where you can take an NRA course in a group setting, and pay, $100 or something for 5-6
Well,
hours.
indeed, in Virginia, a hunter safety certificate is sufficient. So it's the course
Right.
work is very minimal compared to Maryland. And guess what? The homicide rate in Virginia is basically half that of Maryland. I think
Interesting.
it's 6.4 homicides per 100,000 in Maryland. My last check was over 11 per 100,000 in Maryland.
Wow. And that's
So
just goes to show you, I mean, and just for people who aren't from this area, DC, Virginia, and Maryland we're all right attached together. I mean, it's just, and that's why the
yes,
Supreme Court justice, for example, work at the Supreme Court in DC, and then 3 of them live in Maryland and the others live in Virginia, I think, or
yes.
maybe some of them live in some of the, I know where the conservative ones are because their address has been made publicly known and the protesters are there. That's why we know that. I actually don't know where the minority live. They may live in DC, but we know where, the Alitos and the Thomases and the rest, and Amy Comey, and then we know where they live because of these protests. And it's terrible and it's still going on. But my point here was to make is that this area is a very small area, and yet the gun laws are so completely different and the gun crime is so completely different.
Well, it is, and Maryland's among the worst. Indeed, Baltimore is one of the worst cities in the entire country, indeed, in the world,
yes,
for violent crime. I mean, it's positively dangerous. I think it's like 58 murders per 100,000.
It's just incredible. And I mean, I grew up in Baltimore, and it's been like that forever. I know my father had a gun carry permit when I was a little girl, because he got one because he had a need. Back then, you needed a need before the Supreme Court justice ruling. Back then, meaning pre-June,
Right.
and because he carried cash for work, was able to get one. But sort of, I grew up in an environment in Baltimore where you didn't know if your car was going to be there in the morning, and you didn't know who was coming in your house, and you didn't know if you were driving down the street and you get carjacked. And that it was better for a while, and it's just bad again.
It's gotten worse. It's gotten very much worse.
It's gotten very worse.
Baltimore is truly dangerous.
Yeah, it really is.
It's great. I used to go to Baltimore and enjoyed the city a great deal. I don't go there anymore.
Yeah, New York and Baltimore as well. New York is going through the same thing, or people don't want to live there because the crime is so bad. Meanwhile, we're having carry permits, which are now, the Supreme Court has ruled in Bruen case that you cannot require a need. You can't restrict it, as we talked about earlier. You can't restrict it to just certain areas, unless there's those 5 exceptions. And yet, we haven't seen a reduction in crime yet, but you think it is motivating people to defend themselves at home. So the timing,
yes,
coming with the crime wave.
And the irony is that permit holders, of all the people in the whole country, the permit holders are probably the most law-abiding people there are.
Yeah.
They have crime rates of less than commissioned police officers. They hardly ever commit violent crime. So to restrict, as Montgomery County has, the carry by permit holders is really nonsensical. It's just, if you're going to control violent crime, it's also the last people you want to restrict.
Yeah. Right. I mean, but there's this misconception by sort of liberal politicians, maybe the media, that permit holders are the danger. Like we saw this in New York with the governor, permit holders, let's keep them away from everybody else. It's like, actually, no, they're the ones who did your 19 hours of training. They're the ones who paid the fees. They're the ones who got the background check. They're not a problem.
They are not the problem. And indeed, DC has recognized that permit holders are not a problem. All the illegal guns held by disqualified people, felons and the like, are the problem.
Yes.
You're not seeing crimes being committed by permit holders.
You're not. So they're going back to where we started with Montgomery County's new law, about to be new law. They are actually keeping they're not passing a law to keep criminals away from all these places. They're passing a law for law-abiding people with carry permits away from these places. I mean, I guess it would apply to both. I guess it applies to both people, you know, but they're not passing a law to say that, oh, this will stop criminals. I mean, that doesn't seem to be the intention.
Because it doesn't. Everybody knows that the criminals are going to ignore this law just like they ignore other laws. Most of them are already disqualified people. They shouldn't have firearms at all. And yet they still carry them. I mean, that's a federal crime of 10 years in prison. That doesn't stop them either.
Right.
So the idea that this is going to make Montgomery County safer is ludicrous.
Because it is ludicrous. And I was going to say, I don't know of any criminals who are going to be abiding by this law and going, oh no, I can't go past that assisted living home now. I can't drive by.
The authors of this legislation seem to believe that guns, inanimate objects that they are, somehow pose a danger merely by their existence. And, you know, I put a gun out on my table once and I watched it all night and it just didn't load itself, didn't go off shooting, doesn't do anything unless somebody actually uses it.
Right.
So why don't they control the people who misuse it and actually throw those people in jail rather than going after law-abiding people who are simply want to protect themselves and exercise their constitutional rights?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. And I would love to hear from the Supreme Court justices what they think about this, as it is just nose, you know, like right in their back pocket, like right in their home base, like where it affects their lives. It's just egregious what they're doing.
Well, fortunately, they can't legislate U.S. Marshals from protecting the members of the court. So I'm hoping that they won't try.
Well, that's a very good point. And they, you know, what these protesters are doing is illegal. It's against federal law. What they are doing is intimidating these justices. And yet the governors are not arresting, or they're not arresting these people, putting them in jail, which would actually stop it.
It's against Montgomery County law.
Oh.
They are, so it's an ordinance already that they're not enforcing. So the irony is rich. They're actually not enforcing county law with respect to these justices when they're actually passing new laws to regulate and restrict law-abiding people. None of this makes good sense.
No, it doesn't. And well, thank you so much. I really appreciate getting your opinion on this and getting your insights and your knowledge on this bill as it just passed City Council today, or County Council today. Right. And so Maryland shall issue. Do you want to just tell everybody where to find the website and how to find your organization?
Well, we welcome members. We're nonpartisan. We're all volunteer. All the dues and contributions go to the cause. I don't get enriched by this. So it's marylandshallissue.org on the web, and come and join us. We need your help. Thank you.
And even from non-residents, it's a great organization to follow because they're also fighting assault weapon ban and other things that are coming up. You'll be tracking. They have a bunch of cases. I've been familiar with them and known them for many years. They do great work. So MSI, as they go by, Maryland Shall Issue, follow them. And you can also get on their email list. You can follow the cases that they are following. And as I think assault weapons ban is probably the biggest one, but this bill is also
several actually. So we have a suit pending in federal court of appeals, Fourth Circuit now, that challenges the constitutionality of the handgun qualification license requirements, under which Maryland says you can't buy a handgun unless you go through 4 hours of training and jump through a whole bunch of hoops and costs before you're even allowed to buy a handgun for possession in the home.
Yes.
A constitutional right has been recognized by the Supreme Court since Heller was decided in 2008.
Yeah.
But the Supreme Court, that's before the Fourth Circuit right now.
Okay.
And we're hoping to get a decision this coming year on that issue.
I will be watching that. DC also has that law where you have to get each gun, you have to take a class and pay a fee.
Well, DC has a registration law as well, but the irony is that every time you buy a handgun in Maryland, that gun is registered, and so it's not like you need to do this in order to simply have a background check. Background checks happen every time a firearm is purchased, and very extensive background checks for the purchase of handguns. So it's just one burden after another designed to discourage the exercise of the right more than anything else.
Absolutely, and that's what the Supreme Court ruling in Bruen was supposed to say, did say. You can't do this anymore unless there's, and you can say it better than I can because you're a constitutional lawyer. This is unless the law has some history, analogous in history, or it goes in the text of the Constitution, you can't do it. And yet these states are doing it anyway.
And that's what we're arguing in the Fourth Circuit now. Needless to say, Maryland doesn't agree. So they have opposed our repeal, and we'll have oral argument on it soon, and we hope a decision.
Great. Thank you so much for being with me, Mark.
My pleasure. Good
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, not at all.
Well, I've been covering gun control laws for a long time, and we are definitely in a new era since the Supreme Court ruled in the Bruen decision that the Second Amendment applies to carry outside the home. And I think that all of these laws will eventually get overturned because once they get to the appeals court level, they do have to abide by the Supreme Court. But the issue is, it's not happening fast. So during this time, while these cases are moving their way through the courts, people are having their rights infringed. And that's what's happening in Montgomery County. Their Second Amendment right to carry legally outside the home is about to be infringed. And that, amazingly, they're doing it also to the Supreme Court justices who just ruled that they can't do this. This is how Washington works. Montgomery County is just one suburb of Washington. I'm Emily Miller. If you like this video and want to see more from me, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button if you liked this one. And I'll be back with some more videos and news from DC.